You stand beneath the sweltering Nigerian sun, its light trickling through the leaves of a tall Iroko tree. The breeze is thick with the scent of earth and yam, and the low thrum of drums echoes somewhere in the distance. Here, centuries before the idea of a Nigeria ever existed, you're surrounded by the thumping heart of sophisticated kingdoms, each with its own language, ruler customs, and vision of the world. In the north, you hear the calls to prayer drifting across the walls of the Sokoto Caliphate, a theocratic empire rooted in Islamic jurisprudence and scholarly governance. In the west, the powerful city-states of the Yoruba flourish, Ibadan, Oyo, and Ife, ruled by Obas and steeped in intricate cosmologies. Meanwhile, to the east, Igbo communities govern themselves through intricate assemblies and elders' councils, forging a different but no less complex structure of communal rule. This isn't the chaotic jungle of colonial imagination. This is a landscape of order and rhythm where trade routes stretch across deserts and rivers like invisible webs, where bronze casters mold the heads of kings and griots, sing the histories of lineages older than any European empire. British eyes, however, do not see these civilizational layers. They see palm oil and potential. The Industrial Revolution is humming back in England, and its factories are parched for raw materials, especially palm oil, that slippery red lifeblood used in soap lubrication and cooking. And so with the swagger of empire and the cold logic of economics, they begin inching inward. At first, it's not conquest with guns, it's commerce cloaked in contracts. British traders set up coastal forts, especially around Lagos and the Niger Delta. They ally with local rulers, occasionally manipulate rivalries, and gradually convert trade relationships into political influence. It begins to resemble a courtship, rosy and promising, but soon morphs into a quiet invasion. Treaties signed under duress become the legal excuse for annexation. British gunboats cruise the creeks, enforcing order and subtly displacing traditional authority. Historians still debate whether these early treaties were fully understood by the local chiefs or were simply shrewdly misrepresented by colonial agents trained in doublespeak. By the late 1800s, the British Crown formalizes its grip through two main administrative zones: the Lagos colony annexed in 1861 and the Oil Rivers Protectorate, which later morphs into the Niger Coast Protectorate. Meanwhile, deeper inland, the Royal Niger Company, a commercial enterprise given governmental powers, sets up shop along the River Niger, acting less like a merchant and more like a sovereign, levying taxes and punishing dissent. A fun little historical irony: the Royal Niger Company's headquarters sits in London, not Lokoja, where its supposed jurisdiction lies. You're governed by a company whose boardroom is thousands of miles away and whose members have never set foot on your soil. Still, even in this tightening grip, the land resists. You watch Igbo communities mount isolated rebellions when their local autonomy is undermined. In the north, the Sokoto Caliphate eyes the encroaching British skeptically, knowing that the Europeans, with their disdain for Islamic authority, intend more than just trade. And yet resistance is fractured. The British are playing a long game. They exploit every fault line between ethnic groups, between rulers and subjects, between the literate and the traditional. By 1900, the British declare the end of company rule and assume full imperial control, carving Nigeria into the northern and southern protectorates. The Sokoto Caliphate is forcefully subsumed, though British officials choose to preserve some of its hierarchical structures through indirect rule, a system where local leaders are retained but only to enforce British policies. You as a subject may still see your emir or oba, but their power is now filtered through a white district officer sitting behind a desk in khaki shorts. It's power by proxy, and it feels like a puppet show. It's also a slow erasure. Ancient forms of justice are replaced by foreign codes. Missionaries flood the south, opening schools and churches, offering literacy in exchange for loyalty. Christianity spreads like fire through dry grass, and with it, Western education. But it's a double-edged sword. While the colonialists hoped this would pacify, you start to see that the educated elites, they nurture those who learn to write in English and quote Shakespeare, begin to question why they remain second-class citizens in their own homeland. It's almost poetic. The very tools used to tame you are sharpening your mind. And through it all, the landscape changes. The great kingdoms weaken, their powers diluted. New urban centers like Lagos and Ibadan grow, absorbing people from all over the land. Ethnic boundaries blur just enough to breed collaboration and just enough to breed competition. You begin to see whispers of a shared identity flicker in the air. Not Yoruba, not Igbo, not Hausa, just Nigerian. It's still vague, still embryonic, but it's there. A quirky historical side note: in 1897, the British launch a punitive expedition to Benin City, torching the great capital and looting the magnificent Benin bronzes, some of the most stunning artworks ever produced in Africa. The act is brutal, the theft massive. Today, many of those bronzes still sit in British museums, their return the subject of heated global debate. But even then, as your ancestors watch their city burn, a sense of something deeper takes root, a realization that foreign rule is not just about governance, it's about narrative pride and who gets to define a people's past. You don't yet know when the tide will turn, but already in whispers and dreams, you sense the stirring of a question. If we were kings once, why not again? You wake one morning to find that your land is now a line on someone else's map. You didn't draw it? No one asked. But there it is in black ink on white parchment, fresh from the desks of British civil servants, your future boxed and labelled as the Northern Protectorate, the Southern Protectorate, and the Lagos Colony. The British haven't merely taken land, they've taken scissors to the social fabric and stitched together something new, something awkward, a territory made not for you, but for them. The stitchwork is rough. You live in a country that now officially exists on paper, but whose peoples speak over 400 languages, follow different gods, and answer to different rulers. The north is largely Muslim, governed by emirs under the sprawling structure of the Sokoto Caliphate. The south, where Christianity and commerce have taken deeper root, is more fragmented, especially among the decentralized Igbo, whose governance rests in village assemblies rather than singular rulers. To the British, this is a problem. Empire likes simplicity, so they try to solve complexity with something they call indirect rule. It sounds gentle, doesn't it? But you quickly learn it's anything but. In the north, it's relatively easy for them. They co-opt the emirs and preserve their courts, keeping Islamic law intact so long as it doesn't conflict with British interests. But in the south, where centralized authority is rare, they improvise. Where no chief exists, they invent one. Suddenly, men you've never respected wear fezzes and carry staffs appointed not by lineage or community consensus, but by a colonial officer with a fountain pen and a fondness for tea. Historians still argue whether indirect rule stabilized Nigeria or merely fractured it further. Some say it prevented mass uprisings by disguising colonial control. Others argue it entrenched divisions, empowering collaborators and undermining traditional forms of governance. What is clear to you, however, is that the system encourages local elites to curry favor with the British, not for the people's benefit, but for personal power. And while this is happening on the political front, there's another transformation underway: taxation. Yes, the British need Nigeria to pay for itself, so they introduce hut taxes, poll taxes, and other levies that feel less like civic contribution and more like financial strangulation. You watch communities that once thrived on subsistence trade, now forced to find coin, often by growing cash crops, groundnuts, in the north cocoa, in the west palm oil, in the east. The economy is slowly reoriented, not to feed you, but to feed the empire. Meanwhile, railroads snake across the land like metal vines, not to connect villages out of goodwill, but to link mines to ports fields, to factories abroad. You see tracks laid through sacred groves and ancestral lands. Workers, often conscripted or underpaid, sweat beneath the sun, hammering in the skeleton of a future they have no say in. A train rolls by. Onboard goods outbound, silence inbound. But this control, this rigid system, isn't invincible. Beneath the surface, it's already cracking. The imposition of alien laws and disrespect for indigenous customs begins to breed resentment. You notice whispers turning into murmurs. People talk, secretly at first, then publicly. Resistance movements begin to blossom, not in grand revolutions just yet, but in the slow, thorny form of passive resistance and cultural defiance. It's also around this time that the British try their hand at merging their two protectorates. In 1914, they officially amalgamate northern and southern Nigeria under one colonial administration led by a Governor-General, Sir Frederick Lugard. And just like that, the modern shape of Nigeria is born not from consensus or referendum, but from a British ledger book and a desire for administrative efficiency. You, a Hausa trader from Kano, are now officially in the same country as an Igbo farmer from Awka, though neither of you knows what this means nor whether it will work. Lugard justifies the union by arguing that the richer South can subsidize the poorer North. It's a marriage of convenience with no love story, and the wedding takes place without witnesses. The British don't ask how the people feel about being glued together. To them, Nigeria is not a nation, it's a unit of revenue. A lesser-known yet illuminating detail from this period: the name Nigeria itself was coined by Flora Shaw, a British journalist who would later marry Lugard. She wanted something short and marketable for her articles, so she mashed Niger, the river with area. That's right, you now live in a country named like a real estate brand. No grand etymology, no ancestral roots. Just a colonial coinage casually dropped in print. As the years pass, your sense of displacement grows. In the South, schools are more common. You or your children may attend one learning British history, British manners, and British morals. But in the North, Western education is slow to spread, as the British, fearing disruption to the established emirate system, resist its advance. This educational imbalance will fester for decades, sowing inequalities that echo through time. You notice the contradictions mount. They say you're British subjects, but you have no rights. They say they've brought civilization, but beat back every sign of dissent. They say they're governing with local consent, but the chiefs they prop up answer to them alone. And most of all, you start to feel it, not in headlines, but in the weight of the day-to-day, the taxes, the land seizures, the laws passed in your name but without your voice. Still, the British believe their system is working. For now, the trains run on time, the exports flow, and the empire smiles. But beneath the surface, across the mountains, deltas, and forests of Nigeria, something restless is stirring. Not yet revolution, but rumble. And you, born into a land divided and ruled from afar, begin to look at your neighbor differently, not just as a fellow tribesman, but as someone trapped in the same net. Maybe, just maybe, if you pull together, you can tear through it. You follow the tracks westward, where iron rails slice through thick forests and rolling hills, past rivers swollen with rain and villages turned silent by expectation. The train screeches through your town at sunrise, belching smoke and moving, not for you, but for the empire. Its cargo isn't passengers. It's palm kernels, tin ore groundnuts, and rubber, all neatly stacked and bound for the sea. You stand beside the tracks and watch it go. It doesn't stop. It never does. The train is the perfect metaphor for British control in Nigeria. It looks modern, purposeful, and loud, but it serves a one-way function. It carries your wealth out, not in. In the early 20th century, you begin to feel this more acutely. Railways are not built to unite communities. They're engineered to funnel resources from Nigeria's interior straight to the ports in Lagos, Warri, and Calabar. Your road to modernity, it turns out, was paved in colonial convenience. But the train isn't just steel, it's change. Because along these routes, you start to notice people moving, Hausa porters heading south, Igbo clerks journeying to northern posts, Yoruba artisans working in distant towns. Colonial Nigeria is forcing your many worlds to collide, sometimes uneasily, sometimes fruitfully. Markets become multilingual, streets bustle with hybrid names and borrowed customs. You're not sure yet what it means to be Nigerian, but slowly that word stops sounding so foreign. Still, the economic hardship is no illusion. Colonial taxation tightens its grip. You don't pay in ideals, you pay in cocoa beans, in labor, in salt from your fields. Refuse to pay and your roof is torn down. Try to protest and you're met with rifles polished in Portsmouth. The so-called native treasury barely trickles back to your village. Most of it floats toward administrative salaries, European-only clubs and bridges leading to mines not markets. But even within this lopsided structure, resistance simmers, and sometimes it explodes. In 1906, you hear tales from the southeast Igbo land of the Ekumeku movement, a guerrilla resistance that spans nearly 20 years. These fighters, mostly from the Anioma region, mount a secretive and stubborn resistance against British rule, hiding in the forests, striking colonial outposts, then vanishing like shadows. Their weapons are few, but their resolve is thick as swamp fog. They're not just fighting soldiers, they're fighting the idea that someone else gets to draw their map. Though the British eventually crush the movement, it leaves a mark. It shows what even fractured resistance can achieve. And it reminds you history is not only written by the victors, it is whispered by the survivors. And then in 1929 something happens that the empire does not expect. You hear the songs before you hear the gunshots. It starts in Aba in southeastern Nigeria. Colonial officers introduce a new tax system on women. This insult cuts deep. Igbo women, long respected for their market leadership and family roles, are suddenly treated like taxable property. Thousands rise in protest, traveling from village to village, clashing pots, chanting in unison, performing the traditional sitting on a man ritual, a form of non-violent resistance and social shaming. You join them in spirit even if you're not there in person. Over 10,000 women march. They shut down courts, block warrant, chiefs demand accountability. It is organized, strategic, and uniquely feminine in its force. British officers call it a riot, but you know better, it is a revolution wrapped in song. The crackdown is brutal. Over 50 women are killed in confrontations. But the impact echoes far beyond Aba. The colonial administration is shaken. They abandon plans for the women's tax and begin to reassess their indirect rule policies. You realize that even the empire, for all its might, is not immune to shame. It's easy to overlook, but this is a turning point. You start to understand that resistance doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a wrapper, carries a baby on its back, and still marches into history. Meanwhile, the cities continue to grow. Lagos becomes a magnet. You might be drawn there yourself looking for work, education, or simply to disappear into a place large enough to carry your dreams. And there you discover a new tool of resistance, the printing press. Newspapers like the West African Pilot begin to circulate ideas once confined to whispers. Editors like Nnamdi Azikiwe Zik of Africa, they call him pen fiery columns, criticizing British hypocrisy, demanding self-governance, and calling for Pan-African solidarity. These papers become weapons, folded and passed hand to hand. Their ink bleeds courage. Labour unions too begin to organise. Railway workers, clerks, teachers, all those who form the skeletal system of the colony begin to realise their power. In 1945, a nationwide general strike paralyses operations. You see markets shutter, trains halted, classrooms empty. The colonial state stumbles, and though the strike is eventually resolved, the message is clear: you are not silent anymore. Still, the British try to placate rather than change. They create token advisory councils. They allow a few Nigerians into low-tier legislative roles. They teach you the motions of democracy while keeping the power levers locked in their offices. You're allowed to speak, just not too loudly. Yet under the surface, your land is changing. You now share grievances across ethnic lines. The Igbo merchant, the Yoruba clerk, the Hausa railway porter, they all chafe under the same foreign thumb. Your unity may still be fragile, but your frustration is increasingly collective. And perhaps the most powerful shift is this: the next generation is being born not just under colonialism, but into resistance. Your children will not grow up as quiet subjects. They will grow up asking questions, dangerous questions. And that, as history shows, is how all empires eventually unravel. You wake to the muffled sound of distant drumming and the rhythmic shuffle of feet in the dust. The air is heavy, not just with heat, but with defiance. In the southeast, thousands of women gather again, their wrappers tied tightly, their heads held high, faces glowing with sweat and determination. You've seen protests before, but this is different. There's no single leader, no loud declaration, and yet the movement moves like water, spilling across towns and villages uncontainable. The memory of 1929's Aba Women's War still lingers in the collective air like the aftershock of thunder. But this time the fight isn't only about taxes, it's about power, respect, and being heard. You walk among them not as a participant this time, but as an observer drawn in by the gravity of it. They're confronting native authorities, challenging warrant chiefs, and demanding a seat at the table. Colonial officers fumble to understand. Their reports call it unrest. But what you see, what anyone with eyes can see, is that Nigerian women, long kept in the margins of colonial plans, are asserting themselves as the soul of the nation to be. This isn't just in Igbo land either. In Abeokuta, the Egba Women's Union, led by the formidable Funmilayo Ransom Kuti, confronts the Alake of Egbaland himself, a traditional ruler turned colonial collaborator. You hear of her standing tall before the council, demanding the abolition of unfair taxes and the resignation of the Alake. She's fearless. When authorities ban public gatherings, she invites thousands of women to meet on her own compound. You smile at the irony. The colonial system, with all its regiments and rifles, is visibly shaken by the clanging of cooking pots and the singing of old songs. Ransom Kuti isn't just a protester, she's a writer, an educator, a thinker. She publishes pamphlets, organizes literacy programs, and lays the groundwork for women's political engagement that will outlive both the colonial state and many of its successors. Historians still debate whether she was more dangerous to the empire as a protest leader or as an ideologue quietly radicalizing the next generation of women. You suspect it's both. And yet, for all the power in these women's voices, the colonial system remains firmly in place. You begin to notice how thoroughly the British have hardened the administrative spine of Nigeria. The system runs like clockwork now, but it's a clock designed in Westminster and wound from Lagos. It's built on reports, surveys, ordinances, all cold clinical instruments used to measure the lives of people never invited to write the numbers. The social fabric, too, is being reshaped. Missionary schools continue to produce a class of literate Nigerians who know Shakespeare and Euclid better than they know their own grandparents' stories. Some of them become teachers, clerks, lawyers, positions of modest power, just enough to feel important, but always beneath the white ceiling. You might be one of them. You wear a starched shirt, speak English with precision, and understand the rhythms of colonial bureaucracy. But at night, when the generator buzzes and the ceiling fan turns lazily, you think about your father's farm, your mother's lullabies, the stories whispered around village fires. You feel the growing disconnect and the discontent. In the north, the story's more complex. British officials, wary of disturbing the Muslim Emirates, keep Christian missionaries and Western-style education at bay. The result? The North remains less exposed to formal schooling, less tied into the nationalist discourse brewing in the South. The emirs still wield real influence, but their autonomy is a mirage preserved only to keep colonial control smooth and uninterrupted. You notice this creates a gap, not just in education, but in political consciousness, a crack that will later widen into a fault line. But cracks also let in light. You hear of young northerners beginning to ask questions softly at first, then louder. Men like Aminu Kano begin speaking of reform, equality, and the rights of the Talakawa, the common people. He criticizes not just the colonial state, but the traditional rulers who enforce its will. And while British authorities nod politely, you know they're watching him closely. His ideas are flammable. Meanwhile, Nigeria's cities become cauldrons of change. Lagos pulses with energy. The port bustles. Radios hum with jazz and palm wine music. Slogans are painted on walls in English, Yoruba, Igbo. Cafes turn into debating halls. Politics seeps into everything from taxicabs to church pulpits. You can't buy groundnuts without someone arguing about independence. And what of the youth? They're restless, their minds sharp, their hunger different from their parents'. They want more than reforms, they want control. A future they can shape with their own hands, not one doled out in stages by colonial policy committees. Student unions sprout. Young men and women organize strikes, publish manifestos, stage boycotts. Their fire is raw, sometimes chaotic, but it lights torches across the nation. Still, not everyone marches in the same direction. Ethnic identities begin to harden, partly due to colonial strategies that kept groups administratively and culturally separate. The Northwest and East start viewing one another with a mix of suspicion and competition. Who will lead? Who gets what? The question of Nigeria becomes not just about throwing off British rule, but figuring out how to share power in a country invented by outsiders. This is the dilemma that colonialism leaves behind: unity without cohesion, boundaries without consent. You realize that while the British are slowly preparing to leave, the real challenge is just beginning: how to govern a house built without asking the tenants where the walls should go. And yet amid this complexity, you can feel something rising. It's not just resistance anymore, it's expectation, not just slogans, vision. You walk through a market past women selling yams, men arguing over politics, children in school uniforms. You see past and future colliding in real time. There is noise, there is chaos, but there is also motion. And motion, you think, is how revolutions begin. You walk the sun-baked streets of Lagos and something feels different now. It's not just the clatter of rickety trams or the scent of fried plantains curling through the market air, it's the words floating on every corner. Independence, self-rule, nationhood, once whispered, now shouted. Once printed in pamphlets, now broadcast on the radio. Even the most skeptical market women, the ones who swat away gossip like flies, are talking about it between bargaining calls. Everyone's listening, everyone's waiting. This new wave didn't appear overnight. It began with books, classrooms, and quiet lectures in the corners of colonial schools. The British had planted these seeds themselves. They wanted clerks, not critics. But literacy has a way of turning keys in unexpected locks. You learn to write a letter. Next, you write a protest. You learn to read a ledger. Then you begin to question who owns the account. Education, like fire, does not burn only where you want it to. And so from that smouldering heap of ink and thought emerges a new generation of Nigerian voices trained in English but fluent in resistance. In Lagos, you find Herbert Macaulay, the grandfather of Nigerian nationalism, marching down Broad Street in his starched white suit. A civil engineer by British training, he becomes the empire's most eloquent, thorn-penning-biting articles exposing corruption and founding the Nigerian National Democratic Party, NNDP, as early as 1923. You read his words and it's like hearing your own frustrations spoken back to you in a sharper tongue. But Macaulay isn't alone for long. As Nigeria's cities swell, so does its political consciousness. The press becomes a battlefield, and newspaper editors are the new warriors. You see the rise of Nnamdi Azikiwe Zik to the people whose West African pilot becomes a lightning rod for anti-colonial sentiment. Azikiwe doesn't just preach independence, he builds a political machine, the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroon's NCNC, that stretches across regions and ethnic divides. He tours the country tirelessly, mixing fiery speeches with refined rhetoric. You hear him once, just once, and your blood feels charged. He speaks like a man who has seen the future and has no patience for waiting. In the West, another figure rises, Obafemi Awolowo, leader of the Action Group. Sharp, strategic, and brilliant with policy, he champions education modernization and federalism. His base is Yoruba country, but his ideas ripple far beyond. You begin to hear people debating not just whether Nigeria should be free, but how it should be structured. Parliamentary system, or presidential central government, or federal regions. These are no longer academic questions, they are blueprints for a looming tomorrow. And in the north, Ahmadu Bello steps forward not with protest marches, but with quiet, calculated strength. As the Sardauna of Sokoto and leader of the Northern People's Congress NPC, he commands immense respect among northern emirs and traditionalists. His vision of independence is cautious, his pace deliberate. You hear him speak and feel a different tone, one less fiery, more conservative, but no less invested in the idea of Nigeria on Nigeria's terms. Historians still argue whether these three, Zik, Awo and Bello, worked together or pulled in opposite directions. The truth, you think, lies somewhere in between. They needed each other, but they also needed to outshine one another. Their alliances shifted like desert winds, and their rivalries were as political as they were personal. Still, their energy ignites the people. The cities buzz with rallies, posters, chants. Political parties proliferate like mushrooms after rain, some serious, some opportunistic. You attend a few meetings sitting cross-legged in the back, watching young men in khaki discuss ideas that feel as heady as they do fragile. Everyone wants a future. No one agrees on the furniture. And amid all this, the British begin to blink. They're not blind. They see the tide rising. World War II has bled the empire dry. India is already lost. The Gold Coast, soon to be Ghana, is rattling its chains loudly. Nigeria, once an obedient colony, now feels like a volcano rumbling in slow motion. The British response: gradualism, a carefully managed roadmap to self-governance. Reforms begin in fits and starts. The Richards Constitution of 1946 expands regional representation but keeps real power in colonial hands. The Macpherson Constitution of 1951 takes it further, allowing for a fuller House of Representatives and regional governments. You can now vote if you meet certain qualifications. You can now campaign if your posters don't offend the resident officer. You notice the shifts even in small towns. Local councils hold elections. Regional premiers are appointed. Suddenly your neighbor is an honorable member. The walls of empire don't fall, they peel back like wallpaper, one layer at a time. And yet beneath this tidy facade of political reform, the tension simmers. Ethnic blocs become sharper. The NCNC dominates the East. The Action Group holds the West. The NPC rules the North. A shared goal, independence, unites them, but mutual suspicion keeps them wary. Will one group dominate the others? Who gets Lagos? Who controls the army? Who writes the new constitution? Still you feel a shift in the air. When you walk through the markets of Onitsha, the cafes of Ibadan, or the dusty streets of Kano, you don't just hear about independence anymore, you hear about when. There's a story you like to recall, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps true. A British official once asked a Nigerian teacher what he wanted most from the empire. The man paused and said, "I want to be governed by my own mistakes." That line stays with you, not because it promises utopia, but because it promises ownership. Failure feels more acceptable when it's yours, so you carry on. You attend meetings, you read the papers, you argue with friends, you watch young leaders rise. The colony is still intact, but the center is wobbling. And for the first time in your life, you begin to believe the train might just stop for you after all. You feel it like the dry season breeze before the harmattan. The world is shifting. The year is 1945. The Second World War is over, and Nigeria is not the same. You or someone you know may have served in Burma, India, or North Africa, wearing a khaki uniform that promised pride but offered no voice. You fought for the British Empire, watched men bleed for a king they'd never seen, and returned to find the same colonial stares, the same second-class silence. But something inside you is different now. You've seen a world beyond Lagos, beyond Kano, beyond Ibadan, and you've seen the empire crack. Across Nigeria, veterans return changed. They carry their medals, their trauma, and their questions. Why did we fight? For what kind of freedom? And why, after all this, do we still answer to British voices? You notice they don't walk with the same deference anymore. Their salutes are slower, their eyes bolder. They've learned more than tactics. They've tasted the arrogance of empire up close, and it leaves a bitter aftertaste. This restlessness spreads. In the towns, labor strikes rise like brushfires. In 1945, a massive general strike led by the Nigerian Labour Congress brings the colony to a standstill. You remember the streets, empty offices, silent trams, shuttered markets. Colonial officials scramble. It isn't just about wages anymore, it's about dignity. The press supports the strikers calling for justice, not just compensation. And when the government caves, albeit temporarily, you feel something shift under your feet. You realize that power listens when enough feet march and enough mouths shout. But it's not just resistance that's growing, it's dialogue. The British, reeling from the war and short on resources, begin to talk seriously of reform, and not just on the surface. The new global order, shaped by the Atlantic Charter and the United Nations, promises self-determination. It's a nice phrase. It sits well in speeches, but for you, it means something raw, the end of being managed. So begins a new phase of the colonial experiment constitutional engineering. The Richards Constitution of 1946 is the first attempt at reshaping Nigeria's political landscape. It grants more autonomy to regional governments, gives some Nigerians a louder voice but not a decisive one. It still keeps the colonial governor as the anchor of power. You look at the structure and see what it is, a leash lengthened, not removed. Still within these constraints, something remarkable begins. Political life surges, newspapers boom, political parties blossom. People are no longer content to speak in whispers or vote in small town halls. They want institutions, manifestos, movement. You feel it, especially in the cities. Lagos hums with rallies. In Kano, Zaria, Aba, Enugu, crowds gather in dusty courtyards and city squares. Men climb atop boxes holding pamphlets like sacred texts. Women debate in marketplaces not just about yam prices but about who deserves their vote. But this newfound enthusiasm carries with it an old problem division. Nigeria is one colony but many nations. You live among hundreds of ethnic groups, each with its own language, customs and loyalties. And colonial policy, deliberately or not, has hardened these differences. The North, with its emirate structure, is politically conservative and wary of rapid change. The South, more exposed to Western education and Christian missions, leans toward radical politics and press-fueled activism. Even within the South, Yoruba and Igbo leaders jostle for ideological primacy. Historians still debate whether the British planned this fragmentation as a divide-and-rule strategy or simply stumbled into it. What you know is this: when you talk politics with a stranger, their accent matters. When you read a manifesto, you look for names that sound like yours. You feel pride, yes, but also tension. Nigeria is growing politically, but it's doing so in pieces. Then comes the Macpherson Constitution in 1951. This is bigger. It allows for an elected House of Representatives. Real political parties can now contest for real, measurable power. The three regions, Northwest and East, each get their own regional assemblies. You vote for the first time. The ink stains your thumb, but it leaves a deeper mark in your memory. For the first time, governance feels near. But the elections reveal what you already feared. The North is dominated by the Northern People's Congress (NPC), led by Ahmadu Bello, who prefers to remain Premier of the Northern region, sending his deputy Tafawa Balewa to Lagos instead. The West backs the Action Group AG, led by Obafemi Awolowo, and the East rallies behind the NCNC with Nnamdi Azikiwe at its helm. Three regions, three powers, three visions of Nigeria. Cooperation is possible, but only just. The meetings in Lagos become spectacles. Behind closed doors, the new regional leaders negotiate posture-threaten walkouts. You read about it in the newspapers, which parties stormed out, who accused whom of tribalism, which bill collapsed in the third reading. But through all the chaos, something grows: a strange, shaky democracy. It's loud, it's messy, it's undeniably Nigerian. At the same time, the world beyond your shores shifts again. India is free. Ghana is preparing. The West Indies is stirring. The British Empire, once sprawling and smug, is now trimming its colonial branches like a tired gardener. You see it in the diplomats who visit in the speeches from Whitehall, suddenly filled with terms like self-rule, devolution, Commonwealth partnership. You smile wryly. The empire is learning how to leave without looking like it was kicked out. And as they retreat, the question grows louder. Who will lead Nigeria? Azikiwe, charismatic and pan-Nigerian, is seen as the symbol of independence, but he cannot break the North's electoral dominance. Awolowo, the policy genius, is loved in the West but mistrusted beyond it. Bello, the Northern Titan, holds the largest bloc but shows little interest in national leadership himself. And so the compromise begins to take shape. The North will lead politically, the South will guide administratively. It's not a perfect deal, but it's a step. The British, eager to keep the momentum going, announce a new constitution, the Littleton Constitution of 1954, that lays the groundwork for full self-governance. Nigeria now looks like a federation, not united yet, but at least aligned on paper. Still, the deeper questions remain. Can this house of many rooms hold together once the British leave? Can three political giants walk through the same door without slamming it shut behind them? You don't know yet, no one does, but you feel it in your bones. The British are running out of excuses, and Nigeria is running out of patience. You sit in a makeshift town hall, the air thick with sweat and cigarette smoke, as voices rise, not in argument, but in ambition. Across Nigeria, it's now a cacophony of campaign chants, chalkboard debates, and radio jingles. Political parties aren't just contesting power anymore, they're shaping the very idea of Nigeria, and the dream of independence, once distant and vague, is now something you can taste. But the path is anything but smooth. The 1950s stretch out as a decade of both hope and unease. The regional governments northwest and east now have premiers' cabinets and growing control over their internal affairs. The British still hold the reins on defence, foreign policy and final constitutional authority, but you know they're inching back, slowly, reluctantly, like landlords preparing to hand over a house that was never really theirs. And the tenants? They're already rearranging the furniture. In the West, Obafemi Awolowo and the Action Group AG push hard for rapid modernisation. You watch with awe as free primary education is introduced, the first of its kind in Nigeria. Roads are built, radio stations go live. The West becomes a laboratory of reformist energy, buzzing with the tempo of Awolowo's speeches and vision. But it's not all unity. The Action Group's internal factions grumble, and rivalries sharpen under the surface like knives under velvet. In the East, Nnamdi Azikiwe and the NCNC remain strong. Zeke of Africa is still a national figure, but his firm grip on eastern Nigeria creates friction, especially among those who believe he prioritizes personal loyalty over party unity. You see students protesting his decisions, party members resigning, journalists questioning. But even with the cracks, Azikiwe's charisma and Pan-Africanism remain magnetic. His speeches echo in Ghana, Sierra Leone, and even Harlem. And in the north, Ahmadu Bello, the Sardauna of Sokoto, towers quietly. The NPC dominates the region with disciplined efficiency. You notice how politics here is woven into traditional authority, where emirs and district heads act as both political operators and spiritual leaders. Bello himself refuses to leave Kaduna for Lagos, preferring to lead the north as premier, while his trusted deputy, Tafawa Balewa, becomes the NPC's national face. Historians still argue whether this was strategic brilliance or cautious conservatism. Was Bello protecting northern interests by remaining in the region, or was he deliberately keeping national politics at arm's length? What's certain is this: without the North's consent, independence would remain a fantasy, and the North, cautious of rapid change and southern dominance, held its cards close. And so the country tiptoes into federalism, 3 regions each with its own power-based constitution and ethnic stronghold. It's not unity, it's détente. Then comes the crisis of 1953. The Action Group, bold as ever, pushes a motion in the federal legislature that this House accepts as a primary political objective, the attainment of self-government for Nigeria in 1956. Simple words, explosive consequences. Northern delegates walk out. Riots break out in Kano. Over 30 people are killed in the violence. You read about it in the papers with a pit in your stomach. This isn't just a policy disagreement, it's a clash of visions. For the North, 1956 feels too soon, too fast. They worry about losing their cultural autonomy and being swallowed by a Southern-dominated federation. For the South, delay feels like betrayal. They've waited, they've negotiated, they've compromised. Now they want a date, a deadline, a flag. You begin to hear talk of secession, not from the South, but from the North. The word Araba floats through northern markets and tea shops, whispered with both fear and pride. It means separation. For a moment, Nigeria stands on a precipice, not yet born and already contemplating a breakup. But instead of breaking, something else happens: negotiation. A series of constitutional conferences are held in Lagos in London. Leaders cross oceans and sit around long tables under chandeliers, sipping tea and arguing over maps. Each trip feels like a tug of war, each paragraph of the proposed constitution a battlefield. You hear of deadlocks that last into the early morning, of threats to walk out, of sudden breakthroughs. The result: A new constitution rolled out in 1954 transforms Nigeria into a true federation. The regions are granted greater autonomy. A federal government is firmly established. And crucially, the door to full self-rule is propped open just enough for everyone to glimpse what lies ahead. And so elections come first, regional, then federal. You join long lines in the sun, thumb-inked stomach fluttering. The political landscape is more fragmented now, but also more alive. Newspapers endorse candidates, markets echo with slogans. For the first time, Nigerians aren't just voting, they're dreaming. But underneath the excitement, you notice a tension that keeps pulsing through the nation like a fault line identity. Who is a Nigerian who speaks for all regional parties, talk unity, but act tribal? Newspapers from the West criticize leaders in the East. Northern radio stations warn of Southern domination. It's like watching three orchestras try to perform one song with different sheet music. You also notice something quieter but no less consequential: Britain's increasingly hands-off attitude. The colonial government starts taking a back seat. You sense that more than planning independence, they're managing their exit. Their priorities shift to protecting British business interests, ensuring safe transitions, and drafting the kind of deals that look good in the Times of London. By 1957, the North finally agrees they will accept self-government. The West and East already have it. Now all three regions are aligned, at least in law, if not in love. The train has started to move, and yet you still ask yourself, can these regions, these leaders, this fragile alliance truly hold? Can a country formed by treaty, held together by compromise and governed by three strong-willed men, stand as one? You don't know, no one does, but the next stop is already visible. Independence is not a question anymore. It's a date waiting to be set, a speech waiting to be written, a flag waiting to be raised. And you, standing amid the murmurs and music of a country in rehearsal, feel both terrified and thrilled. The curtain is about to rise. The year is 1958. You find yourself in London, miles away from the dusty streets and palm-lined markets of Nigeria, but your heart remains tethered to that restless land. In grand conference rooms adorned with heavy curtains and polished wood, Nigerian leaders sit with British officials negotiating the fate of a nation not yet born, but already burdened with expectation. The air is thick with the scent of pipe tobacco and the tension of history unfolding. These constitutional conferences are more than bureaucratic formality. They are battlegrounds where Nigeria's future is sketched in fine print. You listen closely to the debates: how to balance regional autonomy with national unity, how to protect minority rights without fracturing the country further, how to arrange a government that can hold together people divided by language, religion, and culture. The stakes are staggering. Every clause, every word matters. One of the most delicate issues is the composition of the federal government. Northern leaders, led by Ahmadu Bello, want safeguards that protect the cultural and political interests of the North, fearing domination by the more educated and economically advanced South. Southern leaders, including Nnamdi Azikiwe and Obafemi Awolowo, press for equal representation and centralized powers that can drive rapid development. The British, caught in the middle, act as both facilitators and gatekeepers, wary of a collapse but unwilling to fully relinquish control. Amid the negotiations, you notice a recurring pattern: compromise. It's a dance of give and take where no one gets everything, but everyone is forced to accept something. The Westminster model is adapted to Nigerian realities, resulting in a federal system with a bicameral legislature, a prime minister, and a governor-general representing the Queen. It is complex, fragile, but hopeful. Yet outside these polished rooms, the mood in Nigeria is electric and unpredictable. Political parties campaign vigorously. Newspapers churn out editorials warning against disunity. Youth groups organize rallies singing the national anthem before it is even official. The idea of Nigeria as a single nation is gaining ground, but it still feels like a dream balanced on a knife's edge. One quirky historical tidbit from this era is the nickname Dr. No, given to Nnamdi Azikiwe by some of his rivals, not for negativity, but for his relentless refusal to accept half measures. Zik was known for vetoing constitutional proposals he felt threatened Nigerian sovereignty. He was a man who could say no so often that it became his trademark, pushing negotiations into long standoffs. His steadfastness earned admiration and frustration alike. Historians still argue whether this toughness helped Nigeria by preserving dignity or delayed progress by fostering deadlock. What you see is a man deeply committed to a vision of Nigeria that is more than just a British creation, a Nigeria ruled by Nigerians on their own terms. And as the 1950s close, the British government announces a firm timetable: Nigeria will gain independence on October 1st, 1960. The news is met with jubilation and anxiety in equal measure. It is a day marked on calendars, a date circled in red, a future finally arriving. But independence, you realize, is not the end of struggle, it is a beginning. The transition exposes fissures beneath the surface. Ethnic tensions simmer. Political rivalries sharpen. Regional differences are magnified by decades of separate development and colonial favoritism. The Northwest and East each have their own ideas of what Nigeria should look like and how power should be shared. The machinery of government is in place, but who will drive it? The parties form coalitions and alliances, some fragile, others opportunistic. The British leave behind not just infrastructure and institutions, but a political landscape as contested as the land itself. You watch the raising of the Nigerian flag on that bright October day, the cheers echoing through the streets of Lagos and beyond. Pride swells in your chest, but so does apprehension. The new nation stands on uncertain ground, its unity untested, its leadership unproven. And yet in that moment all doubt is drowned out by hope. Hope that Nigeria, this patchwork of peoples and histories, can become more than a colonial legacy, that it can become home. October 1st, 1960, dawns clear and bright, the kind of morning where the sun seems to promise new beginnings. You find yourself amidst the throngs gathering in Lagos, eager faces waving flags painted in green and white, the colors of hope stitched into fabric, and hearts alike. The streets buzz with excitement, a palpable energy, as if the entire nation is holding its breath, waiting to exhale into freedom. The ceremony is grand. The Union Jack is lowered for the last time, a symbol of centuries of rule folding away with quiet dignity. Then, with a rising chorus of voices, the Nigerian flag ascends the pole, a banner not just of a country, but of dreams, struggles, and countless sacrifices. Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa delivers a speech tempered with optimism and caution, urging unity and patience in the face of the immense task ahead. You look around and see faces from every corner of the country. Hausa traders from the north, Yoruba elders from the west, Igbo farmers from the east, all standing side by side, united under one flag. Yet beneath the smiles you sense the flicker of unease. This unity, while glorious in its moment, carries the weight of divergent histories, aspirations, and fears. The euphoria of independence is tempered by the reality of governance. The new federal government must balance competing interests, manage ethnic rivalries, and foster national identity in a land that colonial borders hastily stitched together. You hear whispers that this task may be harder than any colonial challenge. Indeed, the political landscape is already tense. The Northern People's Congress holds the majority with Balewa as Prime Minister. The East and West, led by Azikiwe's NCNC and Awolowo's Action Group, respectively remain powerful but wary. Cooperation is essential, yet mutual suspicion lingers, an inheritance from decades of division. Outside the halls of power, ordinary Nigerians grapple with their own challenges. Infrastructure is limited, education gaps persist, regional disparities are stark. The economy, still oriented toward exports, needs diversification, but the spirit of hope is unmistakable. Streets are alive with music, chatter, and the buzz of markets full of promise. A curious detail from this time is the persistence of traditional rulers. Despite political change, emirs, obas, and chiefs continue to wield influence, especially in local affairs. They serve as bridges between modern governance and ancient customs, their roles evolving but never disappearing. You wonder how their authority will fit within the democratic framework. Historians still debate whether these traditional institutions helped stabilize Nigeria or complicated its path to unity. For you, they embody the tension between past and future, the old and the new. As the days turn to months, you notice how fragile this new nation feels. Power struggles flare in legislative assemblies, political alliances shift like sand, ethnic nationalism bubbles just beneath the surface threatening to boil over. But for now, the collective breath holds the dream alive. You reflect on the journey how ancient kingdoms' colonial rule, women's wars, nationalist movements and constitutional battles led to this day. It's a tapestry of resilience and complexity, stitched by hands that refuse to be silenced. And though the road ahead is uncertain, you stand with the rest of Nigeria hopeful that this day, the day of independence, is the first chapter of a story you will all write together. The euphoria of independence settles like a gentle morning mist, softening the edges of decades-long struggles. You walk through your neighborhood hearing the chatter of vendors and children playing beneath the waving new flag. The air is tinged with optimism, but also with the quiet questions that independence inevitably brings. No longer are you subjects of a distant empire. You are citizens of a nation newly born, tasked with an immense responsibility to transform dreams into reality. But freedom is no magic wand. It's a heavy cloak woven with the threads of history, expectation, and challenge. The early years of independence reveal the weight of colonial legacies. Regional divisions fostered by years of indirect rule prove stubborn. The Northwest and East maintain distinct identities, sometimes cooperating, often competing. Ethnic tensions flare, fueled by politics and competition for resources. The country's vast diversity is both its strength and its vulnerability. You see how power is contested not only in parliaments but in streets, universities and villages. Political leaders who once stood united now jockey for dominance. The delicate balance of federalism strains under pressure, exposing fault lines that had long been papered over. Education disparities remain pronounced. The South's schools continue to outpace those in the North, feeding into inequalities in opportunity and representation. Infrastructure gaps, slow development, and economic reliance on exports leaves the country vulnerable to global markets. Yet amid the turmoil, something enduring takes root. Civil society begins to blossom. Newspapers continue to report, sometimes critically. Women's groups organize for rights and education. Young people enter universities, their voices louder and more confident. The Nigerian identity, once fragmented, starts to coalesce in music, literature, and art, expressing both pride and critique. One enduring irony is that many of the institutions shaping independent Nigeria legal systems, civil service structures, educational curricula, are inheritances of the British Empire. You reflect on this, the tools of colonial control have become the scaffolding of self-rule. This transformation is both powerful and precarious. Historians still argue about Nigeria's early post-independence trajectory, whether it was doomed by colonial divisions or if it possessed the seeds for a stable, thriving democracy. What you witness is a nation learning, faltering, and persevering in equal measure. You think back to the Aba Women's War, the constitutional conferences, the marches, the speeches. You realize that independence was not a single moment, but a long, winding journey, one shaped by countless acts of courage, negotiation, and resilience. And now, with the flag raised high and the future uncertain, you step forward into your role, not as a subject, but as an architect of Nigeria's story. It is a story still being written, your story.